Hello, everybody. Thanks very much indeed for joining us in this celebration of the life and work of Georgina Mace. So, Georgina's career was simply astonishing. She was the first woman president of the British Ecological Society. She was also president of the Society for Conservation Biology. Awards, she won the President's Medal from the BES, Fellowship of the Royal Society, Ernst Haeckel Prize, Heineken Prize, International Cosmos Prize, and a damehood. And it's fair to say that these didn't go to her head, and they're not the right way to think about Georgina. Georgina's work changed how we think of the natural world, our place in it, and how we look after it. And that's what we're going to explore today. And we're starting with 3 short talks that are going to try the unenviable task of outlining some of Georgina's most important work. And then we'll go into a panel discussion. And perhaps unusually, there won't be any Q&A, but please do use the Q&A to share your own memories of Georgina or say how she influenced your own work. So the first talk, I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Sandra Diaz, who's Professor of Ecology at the National University of Córdoba in Argentina. And Sandra was co-chair of the first IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. She sadly can't join us today, but here is her talk, Biodiversity Beyond Numbers, which shows how Georgina's thinking has reframed our relationship with nature.
Good afternoon, everyone. Biodiversity as a subject of scientific inquiry has changed dramatically in the past 5 to 3 decades, and especially during the 21st century. Georgina Mace played a leading role in this evolution, and she also described this evolution in one of the most eloquent pieces written on the topic. Her 2014 paper in Science entitled Whose Conservation? Indeed, the focus of the paper was on the history of conservation, but I think it fully applies to biodiversity more widely. Until the early 1990s, biodiversity was considered a passive response variable affected by human actions. Diversity at this point was seen as a fairly academic concept, the territory of ecologists and other nature fanciers. Collateral damage from the human enterprise, or else an idyllic wilderness which we protect only by isolating it from us. But in any case, starkly separate from human well-being. This roughly corresponds to the approach Georgina called nature for itself and nature despite people. Then, in the early 2000s, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment established the concept of ecosystem services in the science policy interface. Nature now is useful and important to humans. This is nature for people, for a mostly generic, homogeneous humanity. And here, not only ecologists, but increasingly economists start sitting at the table. And I will spend a little bit of time on this model because it's the context within which I met Georgina for the first time. We were both engaged in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in the biodiversity section. I had never been deeply engaged in conservation, and I have always been mostly a plant person. So when I met Georgina, I didn't know how prominent she was or what her previous work had been. But I quickly realized there was something particularly important about her. She never spoke much or loudly. She was always getting the work done and never showing off in any way. However, every time she had something to say, the room, which was full of people who I knew to be highly influential and highly vocal, shut up and listened with great respect. So I knew immediately she was special. And I was delighted when we ended up working together in the biodiversity synthesis of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was dominated by the ecosystem science paradigms, so biodiversity didn't feature too prominently until then. That is why I'm so proud of this diagram. In our diagram, biodiversity now started to be visible in the environmental science policy interface, and visible as something that makes a difference to well-being. And that's so through ecosystem processes, but not only through ecosystem processes. This was probably our most influential contribution to the whole Millennium Ecosystem Assessment process. Later on, in the early 2010, there was a growing interest among the social sciences and environmental humanities on biodiversity, and a whole new set of stakeholders started demanding a place at the table. This is the context in which UBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, was born. With a distinctly ambitious mandate, it had to assess the whole of biodiversity, ecosystems, their benefits to people, and all of these from the perspective not only of natural sciences, but also other scholarly disciplines, and also the knowledge systems of indigenous peoples and local practitioners. This, in Georgina's terminology, was a truly peoples and nature approach. In UBES, Georgina and I worked together in constructing this pluralistic framework, and then she was the general review editor when we had to apply the framework to the empirical evidence in order to build the UBES global assessment. But my work with Georgina was not only in the context of international assessments. I also had the privilege to work with her in a number of more academic pursuits, particularly in two areas of common interest: functional biodiversity and pluralistic approaches to the concept of biodiversity. Concerning functional diversity, we had this common interest in incorporating more natural history to biodiversity trends, and particular an interest in how these trends should impact ecosystem functioning and benefits to people. For a while, the whole field was almost completely dominated by biodiversity expressed as species richness, as species numbers. We were trying to go beyond these numbers and statistical models in which every species was equivalent to other species, and we tried to understand how the different biological characteristics of the organism made them differentially vulnerable to human pressures and also have different effects on ecosystem processes and benefits to people. It was at Georgina's encouragement, when she was the director of the Imperial College Center for Population Biology, that we set up the working group entitled Functional Diversity and Phylogenetic Diversity in a Changing World, where I had the great pleasure to meet Andy Purvis. Together with Andy and Georgina and other colleagues, we developed a risk assessment framework that integrates ecological and evolutionary perspectives on functional traits to determine species effects on ecosystems and their tolerance of environmental changes. The main idea is that the security of ecosystem functions and benefits to society depend on how effects and tolerances of organisms, which both depend on combinations of functional traits, correlate across species and how they are arranged on the species phylogeny. Later on, we joined Georgina in yet another working group. This time, it was about what the popular concept of planetary boundaries would mean for biodiversity and how trying to apply it mechanically to biodiversity didn't make much sense. In this article, we propose 3 different facets of biodiversity that could perhaps be better basis for biodiversity boundaries. The genetic library of life as encapsulated by phylogenetic diversity, the condition and extent of biomes, and functional trait or functional type diversity at the large scale. And finally, in this long journey, long in time and also in terms of the range of subjects covered, in the past few years, Georgina became more and more interested in pluralistic approaches to the concept of biodiversity. As an offshoot of our work together in the UBES conceptual framework, and also as an offshoot of her previous work in the ESPA program in the UK, Georgina and I started interacting with social scientists in trying to understand the different perspectives, epistemologies, interests that permeate how we see biodiversity, how we value it, and how we manage it. We were deeply engaged in this article when she died. She had been so active until the very end that it took us all by complete surprise. Overall, for me, working with her has been a great privilege and an unforgettable experience, professionally and personally. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. I'd just like to mention something that Sandra didn't mention in her talk there. Recognizing how Georgina advanced the need for IPBES and helped shape the conceptual framework and drive the science forward, the first IPBES global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services is dedicated to Georgina. The research that really first brought Georgina to prominence was the development of the new IUCN Red List categories and criteria, as well as putting conservation on a much more repeatable, reproducible, objective footing. This new framework opened up whole new avenues for research. And our next talk is from Stuart Butchart on the evolution of the IUCN Red List.
Good afternoon. My name is Stuart Butchart. I'm Chief Scientist at BirdLife International, and in this presentation I'm going to recount some of the story of how the IUCN Red List evolved from an ad hoc compendium to what is now widely regarded as the most objective system for classifying species risk of extinction, and one of the fundamental data sets underpinning the conservation of nature. In particular, Georgina Mace played a key role in transforming the Red List and enabling this authority. And I should start by thanking Craig Hilton-Taylor of the IUCN Red List, who provided a number of the slides that I'm going to show. So the Red List can trace its origins back to the 1930s, when John Charles Phillips, an American conservationist, at a London meeting on the protection of fauna and flora in Africa, suggested the need to survey and document the status of extinct and vanishing species. And the first lists of these appeared in the 1940s. In 1948, the International Union for the Preservation of Nature, which then became the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, was founded, and its constitution charged it with special responsibility for the preservation of species threatened with extinction. In 1949, the suggestion was made to establish what became the Species Survival Commission, focusing specifically on species conservation issues. By 1959, documentation and information on threatened mammals was being compiled in a card index that was kept in a wooden box. By the 1960s, this had evolved into draft data sheets on threatened species in a 2-volume set, and only about 50 of these were produced. So it wasn't until 1964, when lists of rare birds and mammals were distributed as supplements to the IUCN Bulletin, that information on threatened species began to be disseminated more widely. Through the 1960s and 70s, red data books were produced. This name was coined by Sir Peter Scott, and there were volumes of loose leaf data sheets in red binders produced for most vertebrate groups and flowering plants. By the late 70s and 1980s, these had become published books, bound series of IUCN red data books, with ICPP, the International Council for Bird Preservation and the forerunner of BirdLife, producing the first red data books for birds. In 1986, the name changed from Red Data Book to the IUCN Red List of Threatened Animals and Threatened Plants, and the first comprehensive list of threatened species for any group was produced for birds by ICPP in 1988. But already by this time, problems were being identified with the categories that were used in these books, the lack of consistency, good data to underpin them, and problems with taxonomy. So in 1989, the steering committee of the Species Survival Commission requested a process be established to develop a new set of more robust red list categories and criteria to resolve these problems. And a guy called Yuli Seal, who was a member of the steering committee, recommended a young lady called Georgina Mace to take this work forward. And Simon Stuart, who was then head of the IUCN Species Programme, in his characteristic wisdom, contracted Georgina, who also brought along Russ Landy, and together they led this process. And in June '89, Georgina produced a paper describing her first ideas on how a more robust system of red list categories could be produced. And about 15 years ago, a colleague at BirdLife was clearing out old paperwork and found an original copy of this typewritten manuscript with handwritten comments from senior ICBP staff recording their reactions and comments on her proposals. These were the days before track changes, insert comments, and Google Documents, and this is how feedback was shared on proposals. And under the Official Secrets Act 30-year rule, I can now reveal what sort of reaction Georgina's ideas received. And I have to say, they were not very complimentary. Of course, Georgina never saw these quite excoriating comments, but they rather illustrate the response that and the reaction that she received, and the resistance there was to her quite revolutionary proposals. Nevertheless, she persisted, and through a series of workshops, consultations, and testing, a revised set of IUCN Red List categories and criteria were released in 1994. And later that same year, they were applied to a comprehensive taxonomic group for the first time when BirdLife published Birds to Watch 2, the World List of Threatened Birds. And Georgina's genius was in identifying a series of extinction risks like rapid population declines, restricted geographic ranges, small and declining populations, and coming up with quantitative thresholds for criteria based on these different symptoms that could be used to assign species to categories of extinction risk, ranging from least concern through to extinct. And these criteria were, and thresholds for the quantitative parameters were based on population biology, with which Georgina was very familiar. And they are sufficiently robust as to allow consistent application, but simple enough that they could be applied even in data poor situations and across a wide variety of taxa. By 2000, the Red List was launched on this newfangled thing called the World Wide Web, and Georgina took over as chair of the Red List Committee. I joined in about 2002 or 3, and I remember well those early meetings. Birds were still the only group that were comprehensively assessed and properly documented. And much of our time was spent discussing how we could possibly expand the Red List and bring on other taxonomic groups. It's remarkable looking back to those early days when you see now that over 120,000 species have been assessed for the Red List. In the next week or two, another 10,000 will be added in the December 2020 update for the Red List. And over 32,000 species are documented as threatened with extinction. And the taxonomic coverage has gone beyond a few vertebrate groups to include plants, invertebrates, as well as fungi and some protists. And it's no longer a list of cherry-picked and charismatic species or species that conservationists have focused attention on, but there are an increasing number of taxonomic groups that have been comprehensively assessed, in which all species have been assessed for the Red List. And for some speciose and less well-known groups, a sampled approach has been developed and implemented to allow robust inferences to be made about the relative risk of extinction across different groups. Now, Georgina was also a champion of the importance of compiling detailed documentation to justify and support each Red List classification. And that means the Red List is no longer just a list of species, but a compilation of information on the conservation status of species at the global level. So each assessment includes a detailed text account, tabular data on the parameters that are applied to the Red List criteria, such as population size and trends, and range, size and structure, and coding of the threats to each species, the actions underway and needed for its conservation, the habitats the species uses, and the ways in which the species is utilized by people. And these are classified against standardized schemes to allow comparison between species, across taxonomic groups, and between different parts of the world. Importantly, each assessment is supported by a detailed distribution map in digital format. And this alone has become an extraordinary resource for conservation science and biodiversity conservation. The production of the Red List is supported by a Red List partnership of organisations that make a particularly significant contribution through undertaking assessments of large numbers of species, providing technical or financial support. And the Red List partnership guide the development and direction of the Red List. When I first joined BirdLife in the early 2000s, it had just completed its third assessment for the ICN Red List, and thinking was turning to how we could compare these lists and the changes in which species appear on them and which categories they are classified under. And so I worked with Georgina and Simon Stuart and a number of others to develop what we called the Red List Index, extracting from the changes between lists only those that were driven by genuine improvement or deterioration in status, and excluding the ones that were a result of improved knowledge or revised taxonomy, to produce an indicator that shows trends in the extinction risk of species for entire groups of organisms. We published that work in 2004, and in the years since, the Red List Index approach has been applied to a number of other taxonomic groups, with baseline data points for a suite of additional taxa. Over the next decade, a dozen or so additional groups will have been assessed for the second time and allow trends to be calculated and Red List indices to be produced. And this indicator has had quite wide policy uptake, including with the Convention on Biodiversity and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's been proposed as a headline indicator for the post-2020 set of commitments on biodiversity that are currently being negotiated by the world's governments. The Red List contains such a massive information on the extinction risk of species that it's quite difficult to draw out and discern patterns. And Georgina worked with myself and a number of others in producing the first synthetic analysis of what the Red List tells us about the state of nature on our planet. This led to the publication of a global species assessment in 2004 and a follow-up publication in 2008. And these really form the template and inform subsequent reports that followed in the years since then, including the Living Planet Report, the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and the first global assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Even when Georgina was less closely associated with the Red List, her contributions continued. She worked closely with Wendy Foden and I in around 2010 to consider how to incorporate species traits into assessments of climate change vulnerability. And these in turn inform Red List assessments and the coding of climate change as a threat to species on the Red List. And a whole raft of high-profile scientific papers over the last couple of decades illustrate Georgina's legacy, the influential conservation science that flowed from her fundamental contributions that turned the Red List from an ad hoc and idiosyncratic list to a comprehensive and objective biodiversity data set. And finally, I should end by saying what a pleasure it was to work with Georgina for the best part of a couple of decades. As well as a brilliant mind, she was great fun and a genuinely lovely person. The world needs more people like her. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stu. Absolutely, she was so wonderful to work with, and we'll come to reminiscences from the panel after this third talk. So the IUCN Red List is our best way of documenting which species are threatened with extinction, but although that does help with conservation, does help safeguard the future of biodiversity, knowing that species are threatened isn't a guarantee that they'll be saved. true sustainability depends on us incorporating biodiversity into economic decision making and doing so with great care. And this last talk is by Ian Bateman, who's the Professor of Environmental Economics at the University of Exeter. And he's going to explain how ecology and economics can be integrated within the framework of natural capital. And Georgina herself viewed this as perhaps her most important work.
Hello, my name's Ian Bateman, and it's a huge privilege to be able to talk about my friend Georgina Mace, who, in my opinion, was not only one of the great ecologists of the world, but also a pretty damn good environmental economist as well. I took an awful lot from Georgina, including this front slide actually, which I ripped off with her permission, of course, only about a year ago. So I first met Georgina in about 2010 when Bob Watson, the guy in the middle of this slide, invited me to become part of the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. And on the first day, I was introduced to Georgina, who was leading the framework work for the NEA. And we got on extremely well. I was amazed at how much I didn't know about the natural environment after talking to Georgina for just a short while, but she was always incredibly gracious and very supportive. And we ended up actually collaborating together on the framework. And its objective really was to try and integrate natural science and economics into real world decision making. And in effect, what we were trying to do was to map out our take on the notion of a natural capital approach to decision making. We actually ended up working on it right up almost to the present day. In fact, we only published the paper on our view of the natural capital approach early in 2020. So what was that? Well, it was the idea that once we recognise that we have these two sources of input from the sun and the earth itself, then the natural capital stocks of assets and natural processes that the earth provides us with generate a series of services, commonly called ecosystem services, just in the way that other types of capital, like human and manufactured capital, also provide services. And these are combined with these ecosystem services to generate virtually every good that supports well-being on the planet. Now, one of the problems that we were tackling with this was the fact that these different vital goods turned up in a whole range of different natural units. This was difficult for decision making because it's very difficult to try and trade off, for example, a ton of carbon with a visit to an outdoor recreation spot, or something to do with life expectancy, or the amount of pollution in drinking water. These units really don't allow for that easy trade-off, and yet those trade-offs happen every single day. So what we need to do is to recognise that we have limited resources in the world. We can't have infinite amounts of everything, and therefore we have to try and convert those very disparate units into some sort of commensurate unit. And what we're trying to convey is the amount of well-being change that is generated. Now, there isn't a perfect unit for doing this, and after a lot of debate, we did feel that actually the least worst unit was to try and put these into economic values. Not because it's a perfect unit, it's highly imperfect, but it's like democracy. It's a really rubbish approach until you look at all the alternatives. However, one thing that both Georgina and I felt very strongly is that this approach, while it would work for a very large range of the goods and services that we get from using resources, including those from the environment, it wasn't going to work with regard to wild species and biodiversity. And there was a number of reasons for this. One was that I just didn't think that the economic approaches to measuring this were robust enough. But another that Georgina really introduced me to was the problems that we have in terms of our large scientific understanding gaps that exist with regard to the role of biodiversity and the multiple services that it provides for well-being. So instead, what we felt was a better alternative was to try and come up with quantifications of wild species impact and biodiversity. But then you have to be very careful, of course, that these don't get ignored. So the solution to that was to sort of apply these quantifications as constraints on decision making. For example, during the NEA, we talked a lot about no loss constraints. So ruling out decisions which would involve further reductions in biodiversity. Later on, this sort of develops into ideas associated with net gain in biodiversity. Once you've got all that, then you could take these variety of measures, bring them into appraisals, make decisions, change resources, and the system would iterate round again. One of the really lovely insights that Georgina brought to this was that you could see the move from left to right in this diagram as one of resource supply, and she felt that that was often the emphasis that science analyses put on the system, whereas moving from right to left, you got the resource demand that was often emphasised in economic analyses. And what we felt, it was really the interaction of this resource supply and demand which determined how resources were used and which decisions were made. Another important insight that Georgina brought to this was the substitution that had gone on between different types of capital over the years, especially over the years since the middle of the last century, where natural capital has been drawn down to support the growth of human and other capital. Now, to an extent, this has been an absolute godsend to humanity. It's actually, it's resulted in improvements in well-being for not all people around the world, but definitely a majority. So to improvements in health, in education, in life expectancy, that sort of thing. But it's unfortunately gone too far in a number of respects, and climate change is a really good exemplar of that, where we've pushed the atmospheric ability to soak up greenhouse gases too far, and we're degrading that vital natural capital. And therefore, we need some sort of sustainability analysis brought into the appraisal. And this really made us think that there was two vital elements of decision making that you needed to be aware of always. First of all, that you need sustainability rules. If you were going to ensure that future generations have got the same opportunities for well-being as we enjoy, we have to make sure that the stock of capital, particularly natural capital, is not degraded across the generations. And the second is to do with efficiency of resource use, translated into looking at all the benefits and all of the costs that occur under a certain decision, and also looking across alternative decisions to make sure that you're making the best use of those resources. And within the NEA, we illustrated this through a number of scenario analyses, for example, comparing an intensification scenario with one where we were more interested in a wider set of benefits and costs. And if you just looked at market values, then often what you'd find is that the intensification approach looked like the best decision. It gave you the best outcomes in terms of market value. Does that mean it's the best option? Well, what the NEA showed is that often that's not the case, because when you bring in a wider set of values, then actually you can find that just following the market can result in lower values across the whole of society than actually thinking about the diversity of ecosystem services that natural capital provides. Also thought a lot about sustainability in those exercises, so looking at the changes in land use value arising from those changes I've just talked about. So under market value maximisation, really intensifying land use so that you get the most value that passes through the market, but then comparing that, as before, with maximising all of the values across the market and generating vastly larger value, but then saying, well, okay, that's fine, you looked at all of the costs and benefits, but where's the sustainability in this? Where's the constraint that makes sure we don't run down nature's capital? And if you put that in, for example, you make sure that there's no loss of biodiversity, what we find is that actually, while it will reduce maximum value slightly, of course what you're doing is that you're actually also making sure that there is no value loss associated with biodiversity. We don't know what that loss is in monetary terms, but we know that in quantity terms there's no degradation in biodiversity here. And you can see that the trade-off is really quite minor, and you still end up with a much better situation than if you go down that high intensification route. Now, Georgina actually contributed an awful lot to policy and decision making arising from this work. So the NEA itself had an enormous impact upon the Natural Environment White Paper that was brought out at the end of the same year. And that also resulted in the establishment of the Natural Capital Committee, which Georgina and myself were members of. That resulted in a lot of real milestone recommendations. For example, that the government should draw up a 25-year environment plan, providing outlines for that. Pushed on with some more empirical work. Recommendations of changes to the Treasury Green Book, the guidelines for making decisions in government. I'll come back to that in a bit. The government agreed with this, looked very promising. All of the political parties signed up to it, and then this happened, and that somewhat put the brakes on for environmental improvement for some considerable time. We did have to nudge the government back on course for a while, but they did recommit, and by the time you get to about 2017, you get the early signs of some actual government work on a 25-year plan. You get the Green Book being changed the following year. I'll tell you more about that in a sec. And of course the publication of the 25-year plan itself. And that has resulted in some real landmark changes in legislation, in particular the agriculture and environment bills and acts. So that 25-year plan overtly adopted a natural capital approach, and recognised the input that Georgina had put in shaping that. And of course, this thing called the Green Book, which also adopted a natural capital approach. And I'm sure people are more familiar with the 25-year plan, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the Green Book itself. First of all, it's the guidelines which are used to appraise all spending decisions by UK government. So if you want to do something, you've got to get it through these guidelines. Therefore, changing the guidelines changes the way that money is spent by the UK government. And you can see the impact that Georgina had on this, recognising that multiple impacts arise from changes affecting the environment, and they all have to be measured and valued. And then on the stock side, that stocks also have to be systematically measured and monitored. And you get phrases now in the Green Book directly from Georgina's work. I mean, this you wouldn't believe this was really from an international finance department. So you need to be careful about reaching ecological tipping points, which might lead to dramatic or irreversible loss in the assets under consideration, and the need to take into account cumulative effects of multiple investment decisions upon the underpinning stocks of natural capital. Absolutely fantastic. I want to conclude by saying Georgina had an enormous impact on my life. I always knew that what I said was sensible when she was nodding, and when she wasn't, I knew to sit down and shut up as soon as possible. More than all that, though, she was a fantastic friend to me. Yes, she had a crystal clear mind, had an amazing impact on my own thinking and so many others I know. She was also incredibly kind with her help, but she also made me laugh like a drain every time I met her, and that is probably the thing that I most want to remember. She was a fantastic friend, and I miss her greatly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. She was indeed a fantastic friend. And now I'm delighted to be able to invite to your screens a panel of her friends. So we have joining us John Gittleman, who's the Dean of the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia, and who was a fellow PhD student with Georgina. We have Simon Stuart, who's the Director of Strategic Conservation at Synchronicity Earth, and before that was Chair of the IUCN Species Survival Commission, and he worked really closely with Georgina during the development and the implementation of the IUCN Red List categories and criteria. Stu Butchart, who we've heard from, is the Chief Scientist at BirdLife International, the world's largest partnership of national nature conservation organisations. Kate Jones is Professor of Ecology and Biodiversity in the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research at UCL, which Georgina founded in 2012 and was previously also one of Georgina's colleagues at the Institute of Zoology, and Ian Bateman, whose talk we've just heard, Professor of Environmental Economics at the University of Exeter. I'm also delighted to welcome in the background among the attendees, Georgina's family, who are joining us this afternoon as well. I think that her husband Rod is watching, along with their son Ben, their daughter Kate, and their 7-month-old granddaughter Harriet Georgina. So welcome to you as well. And what we're going to try and do, we've heard over the last sort of 45 minutes, Georgina's massive influence on the field. And we're now going to talk about how she was, to us who worked with her and knew her. And John, I'd like to come to you first. So you did a PhD at University of Sussex in what was a really strong department in both evolutionary biology and ecology. So what was that like? What was Georgina like then?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for letting me give you some thoughts and feelings about Georgina at Sussex and general impressions of her. It's great to see so many faces I haven't seen for years. It's unfortunate under these circumstances, but it's also revealing of one of the things that Georgina was really good at, and that is getting people together. I've known Georgina, as you said, Andy, since we were kids. That is when we were graduate students at the University of Sussex in the mid to late 70s. We were part of a group of a half a dozen or so graduate students of Paul Harvey's, a fairly cohesive, interactive, a really smart bunch of students. Paul Greenwood, Peter Greg Smith, Marion East, Robert Gibson, Peter Bennett, and many others. You know, people often say that when you enter graduate or postgraduate studies, the most important quality is who your fellow graduate colleagues are. Maybe more or equally important to your advisor. No doubt this is true for us. We were very lucky to have Georgina as a research colleague and a mate, interacting on a daily friendly basis, both professionally and personally. We spent lots of time in pubs and tea rooms and concerts. It's hard to believe that the whole group actually had lunch just about every day at the heels of Paul Harvey, John Maynard Smith, Brian Charlesworth, and whomever might be visiting at the time. Ernst Mayr, Richard Dawkins, John Krebs, Steve Gould, George Williams. The list of luminaries is unbelievable. I can't imagine a better education. As I said, you know, we were really kids. We really were not knowing at the time how unique, extraordinary, and priceless that experience was. When I reflect on Georgina, two thoughts come to mind. Humble, calm, always consistent demeanor, that uninflected voice that focused on the ideas, and most of all, a keen ability to ask if an idea is interesting. These thoughts and impressions cross my mind often, maybe every day, actually. As graduate students, there were a lot of big ideas and big egos in the room. From Paul Harvey to John Maynard Smith, we as students were always trying to impress, intellectually one up. You got to remember, this was the heyday of Sussex. Behavioral ecology and sociobiology, selfish genery, ESS theory, and yes, the comparative method. Georgina was always supportive. Looking back on it, she was really sort of motherly, with a gentle, consistent smile, there to listen to an idea and give immediate feedback, even when the idea was half-baked or she clearly firmly disagreed. She always found a way to move forward, somehow to take a bad idea and turn it into something, in quotes, interesting. And I want to come back to this word in a second. Georgina was humble. She was subtle, but monumental in her impact. In the early days of comparative work, I vividly recall how Georgina first received the idea about statistical independence in relation to taxonomy or phylogeny. That is, the notion that species traits could not be treated independent and that this could significantly influence comparative results. After spending years going through library journals and books, punching data on computer cards, yes, Georgina punched cards, Georgina amassed probably the largest database at the time on body size, brain size, life histories, population density, on all small mammals. Yep, rodents, bats, lagomorphs, and all sorts of other assorted taxonomic orders. Georgina was informed of this statistical independence issue only months before her viva was scheduled. any of us would have buckled under the stress of the stats, not Georgina. She marshaled on, defended successfully, headed to Washington, D.C. to work with John Eisenberg at the Smithsonian's National Zoo, and she never looked back. Indeed, despite the accumulation of an amazing database from brains to bodies and life histories across all major clades of small mammals, I think Georgina only published 2 small pieces of her dissertation on brain size. Clearly, she knew the future was in conservation, and there was something more important, interesting work to be done in conservation. Georgina's influence on conservation science and policy is profound. It's long-lasting, it's proactive, as you've heard already today. I truly feel that, as with many great thinkers, Georgina's work and influence will not be realized for many years. Just the one achievement to have in our hands, a stable and measurable classification system for levels of extinction for all species diversity, is remarkable. I have been so lucky to work with Georgina on 3 projects: organizing a working group at NCEAS on phylogeny and conservation, creating a new conservation journal, Animal Conservation, and broadening the scope and rigor of the Journal of Zoology, and together with Andy, developing a comparative phylogenetic and predictive approach to extinction risk. I can go on and on about each of these projects. They were really pretty big undertakings, and they simply would not have been possible without the right chemistry of people, the spark that we thought that this was novel, and the persistent encouragement from Georgina. I don't believe I ever heard her say, well, we can't do that. I'm not sure if this is just me or if others also heard in Georgina's plaintive, penetrating voice. Is it interesting? Sorry, I can't do the British voice, guys. There's a lot of meaning there. I've come to realize over the years that she meant interesting in all the right ways. That is, in a non-critical or judgmental way. If something is interesting, it makes you want to know more about it, to take part in it, or that raises an interesting point that we haven't talked about yet. If you were interested in something, you were not willing to be a bystander. You felt the need to participate, engage, and look at the bigger picture. Sussex was a red brick new university, in quotes, dedicated to an interdisciplinary approach. Interestingly, this has recently been written about in a book by Peter Burke titled The Polymath. Whether Sussex really influenced Georgina in this way, I don't know, but no doubt she was always able to tackle conservation from multiple scientific approaches of genetics, population biology, behavioral ecology, phylogenetics, and yes, policy. So wherever I am, in a seminar, some dull committee meeting, or hearing a student or faculty member go off at the rails about something, I can always hear Georgina's even-tempered, calm, confident voice. Stay humble, don't rise to the inflammatory character, and most important, keep asking yourself, is it interesting? I wish I had thanked her for giving me these thoughts and feelings. Georgina left us with a roadmap for the science of conservation, how to measure and classify species extinction, and really an inspiration to make this planet healthier and sustainable. How beautiful it is to see our appreciation in writings and testimonials here today and everywhere around the world. It would indeed be interesting, in a Georgina sort of way, to do something, a prize, an award that brings together the best of academic research and policy action in conservation. It would be fitting tribute to have universities, NGOs, and governmental entities all come together for a prize or an award that would preserve Georgina's legacy. I will miss her.
Thank you, John. And that what you were saying about her intellectual fearlessness if you like, her willingness. I was really struck by one of the quotes on the slide that Stu showed. I wonder what were GM's credentials for undertaking such an exercise. So that intellectual fearlessness to go in there armed with such a fantastic intellect and focus on the interesting, what really matters, and that even temperament. Simon, when you were at IUCN in the mid-1980s, so you were Georgina's kind of contact point there, weren't you, as she was starting to work on the new red list approach. And I guess all of those attributes must have been really tested. What was that time like?
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, John. That was, to put it mildly, interesting. Really, really. Yes, it was an amazing privilege, is all I can say, Andy. I joined IUCN in the mid-1980s, so a few years later than the times that John just spoke about, I think. And by that time, Georgina was working in the British Zoo Federation. And the Species Survival Commission of IUCN, which oversaw the red list and still does, was struggling with the fact that the science had become very, was very antiquated, and there were a lot of power systems being used by individuals to control the listing of species using a substandard system in any case. And I guess my reminiscences aren't going to be so much about the details of the process and the science, but more what it was like, what Georgina was like. And it was at a steering committee of the Species Survival Commission in 1987, when, as Stu said, Ulysses Seal, who was one of the people trying to bring change into the way things happened, recommended Georgina as a completely independent person to propose a new system for listing species as threatened with extinction, because previous attempts to reform the system had failed. And I don't know if there's anyone here who remembers Ulysses Seal, but he was a forceful personality.
Very.
Yeah, yeah. If you met him once, you don't forget. And it was tremendous that he did that, because whatever else you say about Ulysses Seal, he was an excellent judge of personality, and he saw in Georgina the right skills to pull off what was an essentially impossible task, because this task had to bring scientific rigor into the chaos of the red list, and it somehow had to get it through the political machinations of IUCN. And anyway, Georgina was selected due to Yuli's force of personality, and she stepped in to take that role, and I was given the privilege of working alongside her, but she was very much the leader all the way through. And those really interesting handwritten comments that you showed, Stu, I don't know whether Georgina saw those or not. I wouldn't assume that she didn't, but if she didn't see those particular ones, she saw many such comments. And one of the things I learned really on is she was never fazed by any of this. She always took it in terms of the fact, or what were the issues, and she always treated people with integrity and as people. She never got involved in nasty fights. And one of the people who wrote some of those comments you showed, Nigel Collar, was very soon co-opted onto the group to work on Georgina's ideas. And that was absolutely critical. She found she did it many times, people who were really disagreeing with her strongly, but she saw lots of potential in them, and she brought them onto the team. And that happened with Nigel. That was one of many. She also saw young rising stars. So one of the people she brought in while still a PhD student onto the inner team was E.J. Milner-Galland, now very famous, completely unknown at the time. She saw potential in E.J., and E.J. made critical contributions to the system that we now have. A bit later on, after the system was adopted, we had an IUCN Congress, and there was this, well, I'll use the words, angry young man from Venezuela with long hair who was railing against the colonial way in which red listing was done and the centralized approaches and things like that. And frankly, it was getting quite irritating. And Georgina says, I like this guy. I like him. We can have him. And so she made him chair of the National Red List Working Group. His name, as some of you will know, is John Paul Rodriguez. 20 years later, he became chair of the Species Survival Commission. Again, she spotted real talent and brought it in. She avoided the fights in a sense, or she made the fight legitimate, intellectual discussion rather than a fight. That's what she did.
It must have been, sorry, I just wanted to chip in, because she was still early in her career, yeah, and not a loud personality. And she was introducing a new system that was kind of revolutionary and had lots of opposition with some very forceful sort of alpha male personalities. Yeah. So all the way, you know, that early in her career, she was able to just triumph nonetheless. It's amazing. So was it just through the same sort of patience and focus that she showed in the time when I knew her?
I think, Andy, so the critical moment was at the IUCN Congress in 1996, because we just, 2 years before the red list categories and criteria that she'd led on were adopted by IUCN. That was a long enough process. And then we had the temerity to list the Atlantic cod and the bluefin tuna as threatened. And that sent government fisheries agencies berserk. And so the IUCN Congress in Montreal in 1996 became a huge, great fight. And there was what we call a contact group, where when there's a dispute, people get drawn together into a little negotiating group to sort it out. And we had alpha male government fisheries agency biologists sent in by their ministers, actually. I don't think they necessarily always agreed with the charge that they were given. And to fight against the IUCN Red List system. And there, Georgina sat in the meeting, and we had several sessions of this contact group, and all these accusations came in, and then she would give very crystal clear scientific explanations of the criteria and why they were valid proxies for measuring extinction risk. And each time, people were left more or less unable to answer it. And we ended up in those awkward silences you get in meetings where no one quite knows what to do. You've got a bunch of people sent in by ministers, sort of agreeing with her, but can't say it. And anyway, that in a sense was I guess her ultimate victory, in that the fact that they were unable to pin scientific fault on the system at that point is how it got through. But I'd say she was always sure of the ground that she stood on. She never got flustered or never panicked under these attacks. She always kept that sense of humor. She could always make things funny. I've recounted to a number of you when I was overly polite to her in one of our many workshops. She accused me in front of everyone else of being a slimy toad, you know, and it was, that sort of gives you an idea of what she was like, but it was completely magnificent to work with. Huge insights, incredible people skills, as well as incredible science. And I miss her every day, as everyone else here does. Such a privilege to work with her. And without that personality, I think we would never have brought about the changes. The science was important, but the people skills were also critical.
Yeah, thank you. And that combination as well of the intellectual rigor on the detail. So I mean, one of the things that struck me in her career is the way that, having now there's this system set up, then she's able to turn it to the next big question, which is we need indicators of biodiversity that are fit for purpose. And so what we've now got a new data set that we didn't have before. So Stu, you worked with Georgina on developing the Red List Index, and how was that experience, the navigating between kind of almost nerdy technical detail throughout into the policy implications?
Yeah, it was one of a number of such challenges that we faced. I remember lots of meetings and workshops sitting with Georgina and various others around the table trying to grapple with difficult issues, practical problems relating to conservation science and policy, from how to incorporate species into environmental accounts, how to synthesize the massive data on the red list, how to develop indicators to measure the sustainability of our use of species, or which indicators we should use to measure progress to biodiversity targets. And as you say, one of these issues and problems and challenges was how do we examine changes in the red list over time to develop a meaningful biodiversity indicator. And this was one of the sort of first things I did when I moved to BirdLife, and I sort of started the process by working out how do we extract from the massive changes between one list and the next those that represent genuine improvements or deteriorations in the status of the species. The vast majority of recategorizations are because we have better knowledge about the threats to a species, the distribution, the abundance, or because of revisions to taxonomy. But once we got that set of species, the next challenge was how do we turn these numbers into a metric of change in status over time, something which we termed the Red List Index, as you said. And we grappled with the trade-offs between scientific exactitude and communications imperatives. Should the index go up or down when things get worse? Does it show changes in state or rate of change in states? And how do we explain and communicate what it shows? And in those discussions, as with the ones on the other topics I mentioned, Georgina was always very clear in her vision, able to disentangle the arguments and the trade-offs and see sensible solutions and articulate these really clearly. And it was always worth listening to her carefully, and that always happened in these meetings because people rapidly learned that what she had to say was very worth listening to. And she always made similar contributions, but as you said, as Simon alluded to, not in a pushy or egotistical or domineering way, unlike, you know, some of the most successful people in science. We know there are lots of big egos. And I guess we got it more or less right with the Red List Index, because it, you know, as I said, it's been very widely taken up since, from the UN to the CBD. It successfully navigates that balance between something simple enough to communicate an idea, but being scientifically rigorous enough to stand up. And it's testament to Georgina's influential thinking, sound ideas, wide understanding, creative suggestions, all delivered in a very humble yet authoritative way. And as others said, you know, and we all feel very privileged to have had the chance to work with her and the chance to have been her friend and colleague over the past few years.
Absolutely. And so my own working with Georgina also stemmed from that 1996 Red List, which included mammals for the first time. And she rang me up 1st of September 1996. And we reckoned that we'd very quickly be able to get a short Nature paper looking at correlates of extinction risk. And 4 years later, we had a manuscript ready to submit. But it was just such good fun. I've never laughed as much in work as in meetings with Georgina. I mean, Ian, you mentioned that she made you laugh like a drain. And Kate, I guess that was also when you started working with Georgina as well in the mammal project when you were working with John and myself and Georgina. And then also at UCL. And while she was doing all of this, as well as juggling a family and developing the Red List Index and developing the extinction risk modeling, she was also taking on leadership role at the Institute of Zoology and still didn't seem rushed. What was that time like for you?
I mean, she had a really massive transformatory change on science and how science is done at Zoological Society of London. And she really, I think she really put science on a really firm footing there. And, you know, she kind of embedded it in all their work. So, you know, I think Simon and Stuart were talking about how she started the Red List, and she was working there as a postdoc in 1986, working for the Zoo Federation first, and then she kind of migrated over to the Institute of Zoology, which is the main kind of science bit of ZSL. And you know, she was there when I met her in 2000. So I was working for Andy and John when I first met Georgina, and she'd already become the director of science at ZSL, but also the head of the Institute of Zoology. So you can just see how she was so kind and so strategically thinking that was kind of recognized at ZSL, and she became a really, really important person. They kind of recognized how amazing she was, and her kind of leadership style like completely reshaped the role of science there. And she was really good at picking up on the things which were really needed. So what was the next thing to do? And she was just really strategic in the way that she could think about that really clearly. And so she kind of reshaped ZSL's science and set up new themes and things that she thought were really important, but she did it in a quiet, collaborative, co-developed way. It wasn't very top-down, it was more of a bottom-up way, and those themes are still present now at ZSL. They haven't fundamentally changed since she did that. And she kind of had, you know, time for everyone. And I joined ZSL in 2005, and what a place to be. It was just absolutely, it was brilliant. It was really brilliant. And the way that was such a supportive place, and the way science was done in a collaborative way has really shaped how I think about science and how, you know, I do science. And, you know, she set up the indicators and assessments unit there. And that was a really massive, big deal for ZSL, because it kind of helped shape the work on the indicators that Simon and Stuart were talking about, the Red List, sampled Red List Index, the Living Planet Index. Those are all homes for those indicators, which then became the key metrics that all these international policies and indicators that became the measure for those, like the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, use those indicators to track progress. So I think that was really brilliant. And she left ZSL in 2006, and I'm hoping that wasn't anything to do with me being there, but I think she really wanted to like just start to get away a bit from the admin and that kind of leadership role. But she really wanted to focus on the questions which really intrigued her, which was this actual fundamental link between people and nature and society. And I think, as you said, Andy, that was what she thought was really important. You know, that the Red List was really important, but if you're actually going to do something about changing people's hearts and minds, you had to really link it to people and economies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the things, so both John and Simon have mentioned her intellectual fearlessness, and I don't. So it seems like it's the combination of that and always focusing on the interesting, what comes next, what comes next. So by the last sort of decade or so, disciplinary boundaries simply didn't apply to her, as far as I can see. So Ian, what was it like working with her on the conceptual framework for the National Ecosystem Assessment, safe in the knowledge that no one had ever done a National Ecosystem Assessment before?
Yes. Well, I want to preface it by just saying it's just amazing how many people are saying almost identical things about her that I felt about her, because I come from a slightly different angle, and it's just wonderful to hear all these people saying the same experiences I have of intellectual openness, kindness, and also very, very funny. Now, one new thing though that I found was from Simon, that I realise now my working relationship started with Georgina in the very best way possible, and I didn't realise it until literally 10 minutes ago, and that is I disagreed with her. And Bob Watson sent me this this chapter on this framework for the NEA, and he said, what do you think of it? And I said, well, the science sounds amazing, absolutely fantastic, but the economics is pants. And he said, oh, well, you better come and see the person that's leading it. And so and it shows how shielded economists are. I went in thinking, well, I don't know who she is. I mean, I presume female from the name. And this very nice lady came up and started talking to me. And after a while, I realised it was Georgina. And very quickly, we went through everything. And what I think really piqued her is that she understood the whole economic way of looking at that resource demand side, and she could see straight away how it fits with that resource supply side, which is more of the science view of it. And I really think, in retrospect, we left that meeting with her having a pretty clear idea of what the NEA framework was going to be, and me just thinking, well, that's straightened her out on economics, so that's fine. And I was just amazed when she then got in touch and said, well, we're writing this thing together then. And that was quite an overawing experience, which she took full advantage of to her own amusement. I remember her inviting me back to her home near Camden, and she invited all these other really top brass professors as well. And I was pretty new to the game, and I was a bit overawed by all this. And she just kept saying these ridiculously funny things all night and just making me laugh in front of all these people that I was trying to be very proper with and trying to impress, that actually economists could be worth talking to. And I remember at one point she made me laugh so much that actually, I'm sorry about this, but red wine actually came out of my nose, and that just cracked her up. That was the top point of the night for her. You could tell it was just like, yes. And so with a start like that, it couldn't really go wrong after that. The times I treasured every moment I had with her, but the ones that were really special was when she would just say, right, you and me, we're having a day in the house. Or I remember she took me to the British Library Cafe for entire days, and it was just wonderful. One of the best intellectual experiences I will ever have. And it's because I have been incredibly lucky in my career, but to meet someone who had that clarity of intellect in your life, that is a gift. And I realized a lot of us recognize that because we had that experience with her. I always knew, as I said in the talk, but badly recorded, so I'll repeat it. I always knew that I ought to stop talking in a room when Georgina wasn't nodding. If I actually got a slight shake of the head, then I knew I needed to sit down and shut up really quickly. Amazing intellect, wonderful colleague to work with. I just think we just have to thank our lucky stars that we ever worked with such a person. She added so much to my life, and as I said, I'll miss her dreadfully. So thank you for inviting me to this.
Absolutely. So what I'd like to do is just come around to each of you in turn for just any last things that you'd like to say, a memory, or how Georgina's changed how you do your job. So John, I'll come to you first.
Well, I'll start by embarrassing our moderator. One of the funnest times I ever had was we were doing an NCEAS group, and Georgina and I decided that it was finally time for Andy Purvis to do some field work. And I don't know if you remember this, but we got you focused on raccoons eating Oreo cookies.
Yeah.
So we reckoned that this was going to be Andy's first field paper, you know, the natural diet of the raccoon in California. We got a hoot out of that for many years. I mean, I'm really struck by the comment that Ian made, that I think it's very true, that we each have very clear impressions of Georgina, and they're really quite remarkably similar, especially in this wonderful balance with her confidence, but yet humbleness and no arrogance at all.
Yeah, definitely.
The other thing that really strikes me is the amazing level of efficiency that she must have worked all the time. I mean, I had the same experience that you could spend hours and hours with her talking about nothing. I mean, just sort of life and funny things. And then, you know, it might be midnight and you'd go to sleep. I think she sat there, must have written for 2 or 3 hours and continued to work all night long, because otherwise I have no idea how she generated the wealth and the breadth of work that she did. Maybe she didn't sleep. I don't know.
I do remember seeing her Who's Who entry, which was amazing as you'd expect, but it did have one insight into how she did it: hobbies, none. Simon, if I may come to you for last thought or memory.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are so many, of course. I wrote something, as you know, and several people saw it, about Georgina, and somebody who's now a leader in conservation wrote to me and said, you know, when I was an undergraduate, I really didn't know what to do in conservation. I didn't know what whether there was any future. And so this just an undergraduate wrote to Georgina, big professor, and asked for advice. And Georgina responded, as she did, I think, to everybody quickly, and wrote to an undergraduate she didn't know and gave advice that turned out to be career changing. And that was Georgina. It didn't matter whether somebody was known, unknown, important or not. She had an opportunity to help somebody. She just did it. Life changing. So I would put that out. And I'd just add a little funny thing. Several years ago, we had to get money. I had to get money to flow from one organization to a second organization in order to fund somebody to do work on behalf of a third. So what could possibly go wrong? And we waged bets on which one was most bureaucratically incompetent. And Georgina bet on one organization and I bet on another, and I won. Georgina declared in the end that my organization was more incompetent. And I think it was the only time I ever won anything.
Thank you, Simon.
Okay, let's hear Simon.
So, Stu, over to you.
Yeah, I particularly enjoyed an evening that was organised by the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, MPhil in Conservation Leadership, in which they got Georgina to come along and give an informal evening presentation to the MPhil students on her life in conservation and the route she'd ended up taking to get where she was. And it showed, although she was a titan of science, she was a very human figure, facing the same challenges that as many others, juggling parenthood, family, and career. But she was just brilliant at making the most of the opportunities that serendipity provided her with, and identifying the important issues and the ways of tackling them. And as others have said, she was also so good at looking out for and supporting researchers and staff in the earlier stages of their careers. She suggested that I was nominated for an award that I ended up receiving, and she did the same for many others, always looking out for others and always incredibly supportive. She had that rare combination of a lovely personality and a brilliant mind. And as we've said, the world's a poorer place for her loss.
Yeah. Kate, how about from you, from the one of her colleagues at UCL?
Yeah, so I guess I had a enormous privilege in the last 10 years or so to work with her much more directly, because we UCL managed to put lots of money and get money for ecology and conservation and really support that much more fully, and managed to lure her away from Imperial to UCL somehow. And we kind of had this amazing experience, like setting up a new centre together, and I mean, what a privilege, and it was really good in that, that she had a really kind of ground up way of setting the research agenda, and she really nurtured a supportive working environment, like she did at ZSL, and it was really great, and it remains really central to life at CEBA now, and it's a kind of a good home for Georgina's interdisciplinarity, and it kind of resonated, her work kind of resonated across UCL in the way that she brought people and nature together. But I guess something that I just want to end on, and kind of not mentioned, and it's really important and for our community, and it's really something that's strongly felt, is just being a visible role model for women, but not just women, just people that want a normal work-life balance, like combining the caring for children or relatives, just like being a normal human being and having a brilliant career. And she was so kind with her time and advice. And I think in general, it's always better to be kind than clever and brilliant in science or life. But kind of Georgina shows that you could be both brilliant and kind, which I think is brilliant.
Yeah, no, I echo all of that. I was so lucky to have her as a mentor who welcomed me, into conservation biology, and was just so kind and so supportive. And I saw her doing the same for many others. And I'm struck by, just as her research, her science was kind of laying down how society needs to live, in the future. Also, just by her example, she showed us, great way to be if we can. I'd just like to finish off by thanking everybody for attending, thanking all of our panelists. And I'd like to give the last word to someone who's not here, John Beelby, who wrote on Twitter when Georgina's death was announced, "Always the cleverest person in the room, never wanted to show that she was the cleverest person in the room, took herself off papers if she didn't think she'd contributed, looked out for others, a person of huge integrity. I'll miss her." Thank you, Georgina, for everything.